Some of you, we discussed the 1 Corinthians verse at Pub Theology this week, so we had a good discussion on that. So if you want to know more about that, talk to somebody who went to Pub Theology, or even better, start coming to Pub Theology, and we might just start discussing the text that I'm going to be preaching on, or not be preaching on, because I'm actually not going to. That's not my message this morning. My message this morning actually does come out of Mark, and who teaches with authority. So suppose you wanted to build a new deck or add an addition to your house. Who would you call? Ghostbusters? A computer scientist? Or maybe even your pastor? I'm guessing most of us would not call any one of these three. We would probably call a carpenter or somebody in the construction business. It makes sense, right? I remember when I was getting ready to deploy to Iraq, we had these people that were training us and instructing us how to be medics. We were medics. The instructors were not. They were cooks and truck drivers. I know that they were trying their best to teach us, but they did not have the knowledge or the experience to teach us with authority. And as much as the instructors tried to teach us, it was difficult because they didn't have the knowledge or had never been in a situation what it was like to be a medic. Now, it would happen, now if I tried to be a mechanic and tried to teach somebody who was a mechanic to be a mechanic, would that be good? And first of all, it's not going to happen because I don't know how to be a mechanic, and I'd probably make the person a worse mechanic. Jesus in this passage this morning is calling and is teaching with one of authority. Jesus knows and understands the words that he is teaching. Being the Word of God made incarnate, he had the intimate understanding of what he was teaching. Jesus' teaching is not based on his credentials, nor his ability to cite precedents like the scribes and the scholars, but on the Spirit that descended on him. Jesus' authority came from God. The scribes and the scholars who interpreted and taught the Torah rendered and built their judgment regarding its application. This is like a modern-day lawyer trying to interpret our modern laws, regulations, Constitution, and trying to apply it to their case to get a judgment of not guilty. The scribes tend to be more conservative in their judgments and were based on the precedents derived from their knowledge of earlier experts in the law. The scribes in Jesus' time were powerful and had a major influence on the Jewish society. They had the best seats in the synagogue, and people would rise to their feet when they entered the room. They quickly became opponents to Jesus and will play a major role in his crucifixion. They did not like Jesus, but he did not teach. They did not like Jesus because Jesus was able to teach with an intimacy of the Word of God. So before we move on, let's look at going back into the text of 1 Corinthians in chapter 8. Since we are talking about knowledge, what does the verse out of 1 Corinthians say about knowledge? Knowledge puffs up. Somebody who thinks they know it all, they get their chest puffs up and they think they're better than everybody. But Paul goes on and says, but love builds up. The scribes in Jesus' time definitely were puffed up and thought very highly of themselves. Their judgments were usually based on knowledge and not love. Jesus was teaching a new way of doing business. And it was not puffing one's chest, but loving one another. Jesus teaches us something new because what he's teaching us involves commitment and not just comment. The old definition of lecture was known as a process within the information in the professor's notes is transferred to the student's notebook without going through either of the brain of either one. This is often the case with the teaching that is merely contemporary. It's assumed, like the old scribes and Pharisees, that the truth is found only in the musty pages of the past. Consequently, teaching slips into the boredom rendition of what someone else thought years ago, adding little, subtracting a little, and adding a little here and there. In Jesus, we have a man who stands for what he is saying. Many of the scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' time taught dogmatically, which is to say, out of a rigid past and an unimaginative present. Consequently, even though they taught dogmatically, they did not teach with authority because they were not themselves intimately involved. They did not enter into the situation. They gave textbooks answers that were stale and boring. The hard, agonizing question of life was referred to a shallow solution of the past, which resulted in a dry faith. Not so with Jesus. He took the risks. He entered into the situation and removed beyond the outdated way of doing things. And he spoke to the present using clarity and insight and conviction. When he spoke, you knew he was sincere and not just mouthing the part of the line. You had a feeling that if necessity, he would stake his life on what he was saying, which he did. He was not just a spectator, commentator, observing news. He was committed to making the news. And this was a new kind of teaching, like it was said. Further note, Jesus' teaching authority. Jesus taught with authority because he regarded his hearers with concern and not with contempt. Jesus never played games with people. Rather, he developed a deep concern for all who had learned from him. He simply used stories to draw from the experience of a daily life to illustrate his deep truths. He exhibited far more concern for the message of the kingdom than for his reputation. Far from withdrawing to an inner circle of intellect elitism, he ventured out into the countryside and marketplaces and synagogues to make his views known. He loved people and wanted to help them, so he spoke as plainly as possible. No wonder, then, the common people heard him gladly. Most of his disciples, most of all, it was his discipline. He learned to use words that people could understand and stories that people could understand. In our world today, most technicians, doctors, economists, lawyers, theologians, and ministers have their own language. A man once said he never could figure out what a minister was talking about until he studied a little philosophy, admitting some sermons are like reading an insurance policy or a legal document. They're never quite sure what they're saying. But Jesus' teaching had a ring of authority, a newness, because he was concerned about his hearers. He wanted them to understand, to know, and to learn. So concerned that he even risked himself, sharing himself with his audience. No phony manipulation on his part. No false gimmickry tricks to get the people to open up while he remained closed. Rather, with him, we find a genuine openness and an inner confidence. No wonder his was a new kind of teaching. It was of authority of his whole being, not leaving behind the people that heard his message. Jesus not only taught with authority, but he also called out the unclean spirits. Jesus took the demons seriously, as do present-day psychologists and psychiatrists. Roland Mays said that the demons is a natural function which has the power to take over the whole person with sex, drugs, rock and roll, and the craving for power are examples. Today, sometimes we would call demons possessed possession by the word of psychosis. The dynamics says, Dr. Mays, because evil, when it seizes the total self without regard to the integration of the self. Some will remember William Golding's book, The Lord of the Flies. A small number of boys are the sole survivors of a shipwreck on a remote island. In their effort to survive, they soon developed a society, rather primitive in its form. Evil became an experience and a reality. An old decaying pig's head surrounded with worms and flies became their deity, a god, the Lord of the Flies. Evil began to take over the boys completely, for they started to compete for leadership, power, and possessions. 2 boys are murdered by the other boy before they finally are rescued by a British ship. Like the boys, many of us today have been running desperately along the beaches of the world, hoping against hope for the arrival of a rescue party to free us from ourselves. As Christians, we now can announce that we have the rescue party, and the rescue party has arrived in Jesus. Balance, integrity, and power. He called the demons by names. He thawed their power, casting them out, bringing peace out of the demonic frenzy. And to us, who submit ourselves to his teaching, he casts out the demons, calling them by name: fear, guilt, envy, jealousy, lust, negativity, slander, deceit, revenge. Uncontrolled, these demons will destroy our lives. With Jesus, we can find a way out and to help us control these demons from taking over. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a leader of the German Confession Church, a pastor, a theologian, a faithful disciple of Christ, died in a concentration camp in Germany. In his famous book, Letters and Papers from Prison, there was a prayer that would be good for all of us to pray, regardless of our situations. In me there is darkness, but with thee there is light. I am lonely, but with thou leavest me not. I'm restless, but with thee there is peace. In me there is bitterness, but with thee there is patience. Thy ways are past understanding, but thy knowledge knowest the way for me. Christ does know the way. He is the way. He is the great physician. He is the great counselor. He longs to be our great friend, helping us in our times of need. There is hope in all of this. Sometimes Christ gets into our people, and that's the best news of all. That is the good news that Jesus preaches. Amen.